And yeah, Don, Jeff was telling us a little bit about himself and his background. Um, so yeah, I think
Yeah. Well, Jeff, I apologize for interrupting. Please continue. I don't I came to the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund through Dennis Kitchen.
Hmm.
I'd interviewed Dennis a number of times about the organization for various publications, but tell us a little bit about how the CBLDF kind of came to be. If my memory serves, it was around a comic book store in Indiana called Friendly Frank's.
Exactly. A comic book store called Friendly Franks. And since you're recording now and this is going out to other people, just do a very brief introduction of myself. Jeff Trexler, interim director of the Comic Book
Please.
Legal Defense Fund. I mentioned before my connections to the Triangle, which I know not everybody will appreciate. I went to UNC undergrad and I got my PhD in religious history from Duke. And then from there, I went to Yale Law School. So I'm also an attorney. I specialized in nonprofit organizations, been working in nonprofits and civil society issues my entire career. I've also followed the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund since back actually when I lived in North Carolina. So it was founded back in 1986 in a very interesting set of circumstances. Comic shops, yep. As some of you may remember, you used to get comic books in drugstores, newsstands, department stores, grocery stores. They were kind of everywhere. And they were mainly the ones that everybody was familiar with for kids. There were also comics that were really oriented towards adults, often referred to as underground comics. And then sometimes there were magazines outside of something that was called the Comics Code. But underground comics, and Dennis Kitchen was this prominent underground comics creator and publisher. In the 1980s, starting earlier, but it really took off in the 1980s, there was a development of comic shops. And more comics moved towards these shops that could be found anywhere in a community, in a mall, downtown, near a church or school. And they had a mix of the sort of comics you would find in your drugstore or in your department store, and more adult-oriented comics, often independently produced or produced by underground publishers like Dennis. Kitchen Sink Press was his press. And it is a comic book store that was at the center of this case in the mid-1980s in Friendly Franks. Because one thing that people weren't used to comic book stores that were selling books of mix of stuff for kids and stuff for adults. And a lot of people weren't even familiar that the comics medium was being used to sell things that weren't just in like Casper the Friendly Ghost or Batman. And in this case in Friendly Franks, the police came in and arrested a staffer at the shop for selling certain books. And there were books like Heavy Metal. It's a book that Dennis published called Omaha Cat Dancer. In the comics world, they're seen as classics today. And often, the sort of books that the staffer was arrested for were books where indie creators like yourselves were making careers. These weren't employees of big comic book companies. These were indie creators, freelancers, selling work that was really a reflection of their own creative vision. And now all of a sudden the police were coming in and saying, this is obscene, even though they didn't think it was obscene. It wasn't like filled with people having sex everywhere and that sort of thing. It was something that the community wasn't used to. And the staffer was convicted. So what Dennis did was put together a fundraiser, raise money to fund an appeal. And on appeal, so used the money to hire a lawyer. They won the case on appeal. The conviction was overturned. And from there, they were thinking, there's always been this, long been since the 30s and 40s, these critiques of comic books. And in the 1950s, there's a great comic book scare where there's an attempt in a number of states to have them made illegal, and even reach the halls of Congress. So the idea was they would take the money that was left over from this defense, formally create a nonprofit, and then raise money to support other cases, which they've done for several decades. They've defended, like I said, creators, retailers, work with publishers, teachers, librarians, fans sometimes get arrested for the sort of books they purchase. and they try to keep them out of jail, or if the book is being challenged at a school or library, they want to make sure that the book is kept in school or kept available for the public to access in a public library. I came on board as the interim director in 2020, and we have continued this work. What was interesting from our perspective when I came on board, it was in many ways a time of transition, because there'd been a period of years, there were only like a challenge here, a challenge there, and people were wondering if the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, in its current form anyway, had much left to do. There was a thought, well, maybe they're not book banning. You know, what should we, what is the purpose of this organization? But no sooner had I come on board than we started noticing these things picking up during the pandemic. And then there was a huge flare up starting in Virginia that went viral on YouTube and on Twitter about a book called Genderqueer. And so we got involved in that case. So that's a bit of background in our history. Another thing we've done is we've actually worked with creators and others on issues that affect their ability to get their work in the public eye or keep work they put in the public eye. So for example, there have been intellectual property issues sometimes where somebody claims that there's a trademark violation that's in their work, or they have questions about the use of song lyrics, and we'll help them untangle that, or a movie reference to a movie or a movie personality. We do regular presentations and educational work on intellectual property issues. We've done sessions on contracts, really giving the tools to creators, retailers, and others to be a vital part of the comics community and not have law get in the way.
Jeff, can you tell us a couple of the more prominent cases that
sure.
the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund was involved in?
Probably the most prominent at this point is the one where sorry about that. The one that we handled in Virginia Beach most recently, and it was just 2022, where there was a petition by Virginia has a law that enables any citizen to file a petition in court to have a book declared obscene. And if the book's declared obscene, then it's illegal to sell in Virginia. And there's a presumption anybody distributing the book in Virginia is presumed to know that it's obscene, which means it's more likely for them to go to prison. So simplifying a bit, but that's kind of the gist of it. So you can get you basically get a restraining order preventing the sale of the book, and anybody who's caught distributing the book is presumed to know that it's obscene, and then there's a very high likelihood that they'll go to prison. So what we did there, because I'm an attorney, we actually changed our model, which previously had been raising funds just to hire other lawyers. And I actually represented the author in that case. Amaya Kobabe is the author of Genderqueer, which is a memoir. Really interesting work, scientific, literary, artistically innovative, touching a hot political issue. And we defended this in court and we won. And the statute was declared unconstitutional. The pleadings were declared insufficient. It was a landmark case in the battle to protect genderqueer and other graphic novels that are under attack in schools and libraries and retail across the country. So that's probably the most famous one I think we're associated with. We've also handled a number of cases over the years that have involved comic shops. There was one involving Planet Comics in Oklahoma. There was one in Dallas back when I was teaching there called Keith's Comics, where they arrested a staffer. There was another one involving a creator named Mike Diana, again, an indie creator. So when you think about it, and why I'm really glad I'm talking to you, as states are trying to expand the scope of obscenity laws or laws regarding criminalization of material that a community finds patently offensive, it's not just schools and libraries that get caught up in this. It's that given how many people in comics, just like how many people in writing generally, are on their own, they're either publishing their own works or they are having the work published by others in licensing agreements. They're freelancers. And we're doing what we can, just like we did what we can 20 years ago, to make sure that they don't go to jail. I mean, that's really, a lot of what we try to do. So those are a few of our most famous cases. But like I said, I think the biggest one right now, and the one that I think the most attention has come to, is widely covered from New York Times, Washington Post, Slate, across the world actually, was our Virginia Beach case involving genderqueer.
I'm glad you mentioned Mike Diana, which is a case that goes back quite a long way.
Yep.
But I think most people will agree that his situation was one of the most egregious when it came to punishment.
Yep.
Jeff, could you very quickly just explain to the group what that situation was and what they did to him?
So you have a creator, a Boiled Angel book that's, I think for people who are from certain communities, when they find something that involves a sort of spiritual themes, and there's some themes that could be seen as sexually suggestive, there's this sense that this is profoundly offensive to certain people. And with Mike Diana, I think one of the things that most upset a lot of people were the restrictions on his ability to create, because it wasn't just simply, okay, well, here's the problem that the community has with a book, but how they chose to resolve that issue in terms of a punishment was to limit what he could write and draw. And it's an interesting case in that I think up until a couple years ago, many people looked at it and said it was an artifact of a particular point in time. It's the era where where there's some hangover from Tipper Gore trying to stop rap music, and people thought that all comic shops were dens of evil. And if somebody was doing something that involved sex and something that they look at and they say, oh, like this looks demonic to us. You may remember from the 80s and 90s, the great Satanist scare. There was even a movie with Tom Hanks saying that Dungeons and Dragons was basically a sign of being involved in a satanic cult. And so constitutionally, a book, again, I think there are so many things like the Mike Diana's work that you could find online now, and nobody's doing anything about them. You could find them in comic shops now, and nobody's doing anything about them.
This was a Boiled Angel,
self-published book.
Zine.
Yeah.
It was really limited distribution.
Very limited, yes.
But if I recall correctly, Jeff, one part of his sentence gave the police the authority to come into his house anytime they wanted to check and see if he was creating, if he was drawing.
It was a complete, I guess you could say, Soviet-style chilling effect, or crackdown on his ability to create. And it's the sort of case now, I would say that when I became interim director of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund back in 2020, I would look at that and I would think, well, the odds of that sort of thing happening now are pretty minimal. I think courts, you have a number of comics fans, and particularly more adult themed comics fans, even in superheroes, because they've gotten a lot more sophisticated. But more adult themed comic fans, they're judges, they're lawyers, they're police officers, district attorneys, or even pastors. And I think they look at these books and they don't see them as problematic as people did 20, 30 years ago. And yet, what we've seen in the past 3 years is kind of an attempt to turn back the clock and revise the law in ways that we haven't seen the law being used to do these sort of things, even being interpreted the way it's being interpreted since Mike Diana, and on a broad scale nationwide. I don't think we've seen what we're seeing now to a degree since, say, the 1950s. It's been really interesting from my perspective to be hearing from retailers, librarians, teachers, creators saying, oh, somebody found my work and they called the police and they gave the work to the police and it's now being investigated by the district attorney. So what you're talking about with Mike Diana, which was really a bad thing and so constitutionally questionable, for a while, you could have said it seemed like the exception that proves the rule. That is to say, when you think of cases like this, you think of Mike Diana, but then you're hard pressed to think of others like it. Well, now we can point to cases literally around the country, from Maine to California, from Washington to Florida. One of the big areas where there's a statute with a problem right now is in Connecticut, which recently passed a law for internet distribution. And if you're distributing a work on the internet that any local community finds patently offensive, doesn't have to be obscene, doesn't even have to be sexual. If it's patently offensive to a local community, you could go to jail. And that, to me, it's just setting up something where you could have Michael Diana 2.0.
This whole situation just terrifies me, Jeff.
Mhm,
Tell us a
mhm.
little bit about how the organization assists schools and community libraries that may be facing challenges, book challenges. And
Yeah, and this,
are you seeing a noticeable increase in those kinds of cases now?
yeah, no question. In fact, I just did a couple sessions with educators and librarians at New York Comic Con. I've done similar things at San Diego Comic-Con. I've been requested to do a keynote at a meeting of librarians. I mean, it's just, and I'm being asked to do things in librarians around the country, with libraries around the country and schools. It is nationwide, and it's not just. There's this myth, I think, this popular misconception that it's just the Bible Belt. That it may be sort of the most rural parts of North or South Carolina, Mississippi, whatever. No, it's everywhere. And people are challenging them in New York City. They're challenging them in Portland, Oregon. I'm sure, they're challenging them where you are now, just in terms of all of your various towns, the parents who are raising these issues. So what we've done, and one of the things I'm very proud of in our approach is we work very closely with people on the ground. So I think one of the big shifts in how I approach this is comes from my work with nonprofits and institution building here and abroad, and that is there's kind of a traditional way of fighting these battles, which is you get a report of a school or library where something's under attack, and then you do a press release, you issue a letter, you call out the school, and what ends up happening in that kind of situation is basically the other side just gets hardened. The administrators feel like they're put in a box. The other side gets inflamed. They get to use the tool that it's the outsiders coming in to tell us how to live our lives and what our community values should be. And here you have these people from the big cities trying to teach us to get us to disregard what's right or wrong. But what we've been doing, and it's been very, very, very successful nationwide, is working closely with local teachers, librarians, parents, anybody who's interested in this. Like I say, with the pastors, I do work, I'll talk to the police, I talk to district attorneys, really anybody who is interested in these issues, school administrators, of course, and see what we can do to build an organic support for graphic novels, or and the other books that are being attacked with the graphic novels, so that the books will stay in. And if there's questions of age appropriateness, kind of how we can move beyond the sort of mutual assured destruction of one side calling each other fascists and censors, the other side, calling the other side just groomers and pedophiles. So let's set aside the language and kind of work out a consensus, so that we understand that sort of teen books are for teens and kids books are for kids, and we make sure that those categories actually reflect what those categories should reflect.
Have you been successful in those efforts?
Oh, very, 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 very successful. And that's one of the things I'm very proud of, is that we've had situations where it was a foregone conclusion. It's a week before, 2 weeks before the vote of the school board, and they've counted the votes and they know the books are going to be withdrawn. To okay, well, what can the community do? Who are your trusted community leaders? Who can you have talk to your mayor, talk to your principal, talk to your school board members behind the scenes before the meeting ever happens? Because it's one thing, if you're in this field, that a lot of the action at school board meetings and town council meetings takes place before the meeting. It's not what really happens on the floor in the debate. By the time you get to debate, often the votes are already tallied. In informally behind the scenes, so you know where it's going to go. So what can you do to have this be a truly community movement? And so, for example, one of the things that's emerging from our conversations, we're actually in the process of preparing guides to help local communities around the country, people who are concerned with graphic novels and the themes that are in these graphic novels, manage these things locally, with us advising rather than having the white hat from New York City come in and look like they're putting the local community on the defensive. I grew up in Amish country, small town Pennsylvania. I used to live in Burlington, North Carolina for a period of time, in Mebane, North Carolina. So, I kind of have a sensibility about what can work in a local town. And I've tried to use that to the organization's advantage.
Our General Assembly recently passed what is called a Parents' Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
And it makes it really easy for books to be challenged. A single cuss word or whatever it might be, you're free to run with it. There's a process that, it's not, I don't like this, and I go, okay, it's gone. There's a process, but it tends to make people think, I really need to start banning books. There's books that I don't like. And so I don't want anybody to read them. And obviously a lot of this is pertaining to parents, and the stuff that they are seeing their kids being taught in schools. But Jeff, I wanted to ask you, what is your thinking on why this is happening now?
Oh, that is I love that question. And I think there are several factors. One factor is that, even though both books that have text in them are getting caught up in this, it was really graphic novels that launched the current wave. They've always been at the center. And if you watch the floor debate or read the transcripts, you'll find that when things like the Parents' Bill of Rights are being enacted, they're constantly referring to graphic novels as the reason why they're doing this. And the reason I think why this is that graphic novels are so iconic. We've have this one shift we have is that we have gone in a shift. We have gone in a transition in recent years from being a society where really, if you wanted to succeed, you had to understand text. You had to read a book that was nothing but text, and pictures were seen as, childlike, untruthful, or just, kind of decorative and a fun read, but not really where the mind was advanced or where your career was going to be advanced. You really had to master text. But now we're seeing graphic novels used in schools, and they're not just used for entertainment at recess and break time. They're being integrated into the classroom experience. And more kids are just checking graphic novels out of the library. And so there's this, and the same thing with adults. More and more graphic novels are in public libraries for adults and kids. And they're assuming they're taking a prominent place in displays because they really are what's getting a large amount of the attention. And I think there are people who are looking at graphic novels and manga and saying, oh my word, we're losing literacy. We've seen this in court cases actually and in complaints. This is subliterate. It's making our kids illiterate. And then there's another aspect of it. They see pictures as more dangerous, more problematic. So you'll find things where we often find in challenges where there's certain graphic novel adaptations of a book that are restricted or challenged, even though the text version isn't. And you see people referring to the fact, well, look, you see this picture. They can put the picture on YouTube. They see the picture is more offensive. There's something about all of the information that's contained in a picture and just the visual impact of a picture that they'll see a picture is more dangerous than words. And then I think another one that we cannot underestimate in terms of influence is our expanded understanding of civil rights particularly over the past 20 years. There are two developments. One, I think there's a deepened understanding of some of the more systemic factors in racial discrimination. And so that's something that's being talked a lot about in graphic novels and other books, but graphic novels, and so many of them are self-published or independently created. People are talking about their experience and using their depictions, using images to depict their experiences. And some people don't want to see themselves or the people who look like themselves depicted as discriminatory. And so they're challenging those books. But another big one is the way civil rights law deals with sex. See, when I was in law school 30 years ago, the Supreme Court had recently said that you could go to jail for being gay if that anti-sodomy laws, as they were called, were constitutional. And so you're caught having sex in a same-sex relationship, bam, that was a valid reason for sending you to prison. 20 years ago, the Supreme Court reversed that decision and said, nope, actually constitutionally protected. And they're not just talking about constitutionally protected in terms of right to privacy. They're saying it's constitutionally protected in terms of equal protection, which means it's just part of being it's part of American public life. It's part of civics in a way. And then it expands to protection for gay marriage, protection for gays in the military. Just 3 years ago, the Supreme Court said Title VII about civil rights law for employees and employee-employee relationships applied to same-sex relationships and diverse gender expression, like transgender identity and non-binary identity. And so again, comics are this great participatory medium. People want to create, they want to express themselves, depict themselves. And so we have these very powerful images depicting just being gay or wrestling with discrimination issues in terms of race. It's just part of regular American life. And a lot of people don't know what to do with them. They find them dangerous. They find them threatening to their image of national identity. They find them dangerous because for generations in the United States, sex was a private thing, even legally. So when some of the early cases, like with contraception, the Griswold case, where the Supreme Court said it was legal to constitutional protected to sell contraceptives, that was framed not as in terms of a public thing. It was framed in terms of the right to privacy, the right to people. Sex was a private thing behind closed doors. For years, even sex ed was not very widely taught, or when it was, there was this whole process of getting parental consent, and it was a separate room and everything. So those three things: the spread of graphic novels, a suspicion of images, and the shift in civil rights, the expansion of civil rights law, the past 20 years have just caused this major blow up.
What is the most challenged book in the United States right now? Is it genderqueer?
That would be right. That would be the case the book that I represented in court in Virginia Beach. It's genderqueer. That book has become
This is an
iconic.
autobiographical work.
Autobiographical work.
The author's talking about his life as a gay man. Is that correct?
So this is genderqueer. Maya Kobabe uses E pronouns, and so we'll go. I'd recommend read the book just in terms of coming to grips with the complexities of gender identity and how it relates to traditional understandings of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, and even goes into the science of gender identity and sort of exploring it from all these different perspectives.
What age group is this book appropriate for?
And this is what's wild. We are seeing, I did a lot of investigation of this actually for journalists. There's this common representation. Book is out there and it's for our little kids. It's like for kindergartners or whatever. No. Even the publisher says it's marketed as a book for adults. It may be appropriate for teens, in particular teens in the higher grades, just because kids are wrestling with these issues and and everybody knows they're talking about these issues. And even schools, 99.999% of the schools have this book just for a limited age range in high school, and they don't have them in next to Hop on Pop or something. I mean, it's a different section. But the only thing that I found that has gone against that has dealt with that is there's some databases where you can access books. And there's been arguments, well, some schools have middle schools that subscribe to these databases that include graphic novels. And there's at least one database that has genderqueer in it. And they say, aha, see, little kids can access this book. But that was an accident. That was not intentional. That was not something where somebody went and bought the book and put it on a shelf or said, this is going to be marketed toward kids. That's
when
just
you
something that happened and we did.
when the organization is
Mhm.
approached for assistance by a library or a community library or an individual, whatever it might be, do you mostly provide legal representation? And how often does it go that far? Are you often
I,
able to assist without having to go to court? You know what I mean?
in
And
my,
does a
in
letter
my
sometimes
mind,
work?
well, often it's not a letter from me, it's a letter from the community or conversation in the community. So I would much rather talk to people behind the scenes and then have the people locally do the talking in their community, because I just think they're going to be more trusted and respected than somebody who's not a member of the community, particularly in, small to medium-sized towns. And that's been my experience growing up in one and living in one, is that you know who you trust, and you trust who you know, somebody who shares your values, somebody that you've seen. And so, if I have to come in and do something, if somebody wants me to write a letter, I will. But I'd much rather work with people on the ground locally to make that change, or to have that impact. I view a case that's won. I view a case that's never filed as even more successful than a case that wins in court, because a case that wins in court, you've gone through hundreds of hours, and I do my work pro bono, but I know, that when lawyers are charging for this, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's really stressful for an author. It's stressful for the publisher and distributors. It's a really bad experience. So every case that I can keep out of court is a victory for me. That's the most I do, and I do my, and I can tell you there are cases where you have never heard about and no one's ever heard about, because I had a conversation with the district attorney and said, you're not going to win this case if you bring this, and here's why. And it's a respectful lawyer to lawyer. I'm not like, oh, you Nazi. It's just more like, hey, offer to help. Here, you're a district attorney. I'm a lawyer. I've worked in this area, and I know something about the graphic novels at issue. If you need some help, I'm here to answer any questions. And I found district attorneys have been very responsive to that. And I just have these conversations, and you'll just find these cases going away. Or you'll talk to a school administrator, or you give some legal arguments to somebody to make. And it's not just legal, it can't be legal. It can't just be legal, because there are certain instances in which schools have a little bit more leeway in terms of books they keep out of the curriculum or books they keep out of the library than your normal public library or your store. There are certain books that you can keep out that aren't obscene, but might be, like in a library, deemed pervasively vulgar or not educationally appropriate. And those can be grounds for keeping them out. And that's something that's in a Supreme Court case. So it's going to be hard to fight that. So you have to think about ways, well, how can I argue that this book is not pervasively vulgar? How can I argue that this book is actually educationally appropriate, so that you can keep the book in? And that's those are cases where you don't necessarily want them to go to court, because you're relying on a judge to make some of these judgments, and judges tend to be resistant to making some of these calls. So I do what I can to have those cases resolved before you take a chance on, which judge you're going to get in the draw. Are you going to get somebody who's really, really offended by these sort of things, or you get somebody who understands what they're really about? And I saw a question here, how many books are challenged from the left? And that is a great question, because yes, a number of books have been challenged from the left. And it's also one where a number of those books are not even challenged. That is to say, they're screened before they're purchased, or they're screened off the internet, or you have a web comic that's screened off the internet or kicked off of Indiegogo or Kickstarter. And we've tried to help in those cases as well, because if somebody's taking action against a graphic novel because they're saying a work shouldn't depict these kinds of things, let me give you an example. You mentioned Dennis Kitchen to start. We had a situation that we helped with, one involving material involving manga, one involving Robert Crumb. And so with Robert Crumb, there was somebody who was going through the history of comics and mentioned Robert Crumb. And the progressive students organized and said that the teacher should be fired because they said, Robert Crumb, you look at his comics, their pictures, their images that are racist, sexist, and so on and so forth. And again, people look at Robert Crumb in terms of context of what he was doing in the 1970s, and there's an extensive scholarship on Robert Crumb. And there are folks who say that if you take any of these underground comics from the 1970s, you're going to find a lot of stuff that'd be offensive from a progressive sensibility, even though back in the 70s, these people were hardcore leftists who were writing many of these books. But now the way their images are out of fashion on the left. And so, we come in, what can we do to defend somebody who's just teaching underground comics that are part of our literary legacy? So yes, it is something that's on the left and on the right. And I'm very sensitive to.
That's a really good point. It isn't just one side or the other. It goes both ways. For those who may not know, Robert, most of you probably know who Robert Crumb was, but he was very prominent and exceptionally popular underground cartoonist starting in the late 60s. He created a comic book called Zap, which was one of the very first, if not the very first, underground comic to see popular acceptance. And a lot of his work is offensive in certain ways. And when you read Robert Crumb, you know what you're getting. Yeah,
it's his id writ large.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, he holds nothing back. He pulls back the curtain. This is Robert Crumb. Everybody in this meeting, Jeff, we're all creators. All of us are writers or creators in other ways. I write nonfiction. We've got novelists, short story writers, poets. Our membership is broad. I don't think anyone in our group has yet to face any kind of a challenge of their work. But I wanted to ask what advice you would give individuals such as us on how to protect ourselves or how to react if we are one day challenged. Our work is challenged, either a library or a school board or whatever it might be in the community in general. What can we do to protect ourselves?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And it depends on the nature of the challenge. If it's somebody who is that, there may be certain situations where they're trying to find the creator. They're invoking a law that where the creator could be sent to jail, for example, to give you the worst case scenario, like you've mentioned with the Mike Diana case. And so in that situation, one of the first things you want to do is call a lawyer who is, and you'd also want to, and if you're in the comic space, you would also want to call the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund so we can advise the local lawyer, because we work with local counsel across the country. We're in the process of building a volunteer network to make it even more accessible. But we have worked with local lawyers around the country. Again, I do it pro bono, advising them on how to help people on the ground, creators, comic shop owners, whoever. And there are other situations where your book is caught up in the middle of it, where you just need some strategic advice. So if you find yourself in the middle of it, but you yourself are not at risk, although a teacher or a librarian may face losing their job or worse. Because again, they're trying to expand the scope of criminal laws, like in Missouri, Texas, Connecticut, other states. So I think one of the most important things when you're caught up in the middle of this, either as an author or who is just facing their work being restricted or challenged, or an author who is facing prosecution because of the work that they self-published, is the most important thing is to realize that you are not alone. You are not alone. And as frightening as this is, and you have all these questions, there are a lot of people out there who want to help you. They want to do it for free. And there are people who've been going through these things all around the country. So again, like say it's a graphic novel or a self-published comic or something like that, email me, email the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund at info@cbldf.org, and you will hear back from us. We can set up a call. We can talk through the situation, do some risk assessments. If having local counsel would help, we can help you reach out to local counsel, and depending on the situation, can even help defray the cost, like with the, so that the author is not the one who's paying this.
What
And
resources are available on your website? What I mean, if we just wanted to educate, we wanted to work as an ally, what's available on the CBLD website for
what
us?
we have are a lot of old case studies and some older advice. I mean, by older, I mean the way we have to talk today, pre-pandemic. And so we're in the process of, we've been so focused on the actual work and assessing the new situation and responding on a case-by-case basis around the country, that we're actually in the process of revising all of our written material. So you can see what we did in the past, and we're in the process of putting together guides for how to respond in the present. That is actually our priority for the next quarter, so that we're hoping to have a newsletter, revive our newsletter by the end of the year, definitely by by January 1, which will have regular advice on how to deal with these issues, and also just have guides so anybody can take a look and say, if you are dealing with this situation, here's who you get in touch with: CBLDF, you can get in touch with PEN, you could get in touch with FIRE. We work with all those organizations.
What is FIRE?
That's the foundation for, they just changed their name. It used to be Foundation. They just changed their name, which is why it's out of my head. Let me give it to you right now.
What kind of a group is it?
It's basically, you could see it as the ACLU, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. It used to be just for education, but they recently rebranded to be broader. They've helped a number of authors who are not in the comic space, who've had to deal with this, or teachers, librarians, professors who are not in the comic space. And when they do have a comics case, we've actually worked with them on comics related issues, just like we've worked with other nonprofit organizations whenever comics are at the center, because that's really the focus of what we do. But all of these organizations, we all share strategies. We all discuss what the trends are.
You work together.
Yeah, we all work together. Yeah.
I'm a huge comic book fan. I have been since I was a kid. I've written often about comic book related topics for a variety of publications. And we're talking about censorship of comic books and graphic novels now, but I think it's super important to remember that 70 years ago, comic books were attacked, and there was essentially a industry-wide self-censoring board that came into play and severely restricted what comic books could publish. And that started, I believe, in 1955, and wasn't real. It even banned the words title, horror, and terror on titles of comic books. There was very restrictive of what you could show, what you could talk about. Excuse me. And that wasn't really revised until the early 70s. So this is not a new phenomenon of going after comic books, which back in the 50s were believed to be a prime instigator of juvenile delinquency, horror and crime comics specifically. I just wanted to mention that point of history, showing that what we're dealing with now is not a new phenomenon. It's decades old.
And I want to jump in here, because I know not everybody here does comics. And when this it was called the Comics Code, some of you remember the little thing that looks like a stamp in the Court of Old Comic Books before 2010 that said it was approved by the Comics Code Authority. When the Comics Code was written in 1954, they put in a provision that's often overlooked, but I think is the most important provision of the book for all authors, not just graphic novel authors. And it's this: they said that they say that we don't view ourselves as censors. We're trying to come up with standards for the industry in terms of best practices. And they say, we hope that our standards for comics will be a model for all communications. For all communications. Now we would say cross-platform. They thought that what they were doing wasn't just for comics, but that was a model for publishers, for radio, for movies, for everybody, kind of how an industry could manage content, moderate content. I think we would now say content moderation, so that it was positive for society and didn't have misinformation, as they say today. wasn't it was good for people's mental health, the way, which would be now the way we would frame it. And so, it wouldn't cause people to do a crime, it wouldn't cause people to be depressed. But they saw back in the 1950s, said the Comics Code is good, we believe will be a model for all communications, all media. And I think that even though the Comics Code is gone, that is what has happened. And that is, we're seeing content standards. There's a question about the Mary Louise Gay thing. We're seeing content restrictions put in algorithmically. There's pressure on Visa and MasterCard not to allow themselves to be used for certain types of content. Pressure on PayPal, Venmo, Indiegogo, Kickstarter. There's pressure to have certain types of themes declared inherently inappropriate for children, and to, on that basis, restrict access to adults. So, for example, there are people who have argued that any exploration of LGBTQ themes would be essentially child pornography, or just illegal for children, because since having sex with a child under the age of consent is a criminal act, depicting sexual themes or discussing sexual themes with a child should equally be considered a felony. This is an argument that's now being made nationwide, and there are people who are, like in Missouri, where distributing a book to a student that has nudity in it could be grounds for arresting somebody, sending them to jail. So there's an attempt here to have a whole swath of books about something that is now constitutionally protected. It's part of American civic life, declared illegal. And even if they don't succeed in getting it declared illegal everywhere, there is, I think, there's naturally, publishers and distributors, they don't want to get caught up in these kinds of fights. Not all, a lot of them don't. They don't want, for people who sell books to schools, they don't want their books banned in Texas, because that cuts out 30 to 40% of your market. They don't want it knocked out in New York. They don't want it knocked out in other states that have big markets. And that has downstream effects for all of you. And the same thing for chain bookstores. So there's a real concern that the impact here, even though it's triggered by graphic novels and has some negative externalities or negative impact on books that cover the same themes in text in certain situations, not always, but in some schools and libraries and communities it does, that there are just these ripple effects that affect the choices that are made in terms of what publications are accepted, what manuscripts are accepted, what's distributed, that will affect all authors. So I think it's important for everybody to take seriously, and which gets to just trying to anticipate or guess what could be banned cause more harm than good, or are there actual protections that can be enacted? And I think the answer is yes and no in terms of more harm than good, because the good thing is, I think that there are writers who are trying to think, okay, well, if I face the possibility of my book being not accepted, or my book being not sold to a school, or my book not being picked up by a publisher because it covers certain themes, what can I do to make the same point in a more oblique fashion? And that's what comics did for decades. And sometimes great works of art have come out of trying to do something more obliquely and less directly. And so that can have some positive effect. Just in terms of restrictions can sometimes be restrictions can sometimes fuel creativity. But on the other hand, it does a lot of harm, because a number of authors just start checking themselves and second guessing themselves, or they won't write books on certain themes, or or a publisher will look at a book and say, why can't you just change Jim and John in this relationship to Jim and Jane, because it's greater likelihood that we're not going to get in trouble. And so there's a harmful effect there. So, it's a very interesting situation that we're in the midst of right now. And I think authors are having to assess not simply the size of the advance, but is this publisher going to stand behind me? Is this publisher going to support me? In contracts, one thing we have to advise our people, our constituency about is, if you looked at contracts, there are clauses for termination. There are also morals clauses in a number of contracts, and those morals clauses are being expanded to cover things like any kind of controversy, or you're making representations and warranties where you're saying that the book is not obscene or doesn't have explicit material or doesn't have, you know, whatever your publisher is requiring. And if it gets caught up in a controversy, it could be grounds for terminating your contract if the publisher wanted to go in that direction. How many of you have ever read your indemnification clauses, where there's even clauses where if a book, if you interpret the clause literally, a publisher could come out and say, well, you know, this book was caught up in this controversy and we ended up having to spend so much money on legal fees, and under the indemnification clause, you, the author, have to pay us for that. So it's affecting how
Always important to read your contracts.
Yeah, it's affecting how you want to make sure that you're protected against that. I don't think you're ever going to get rid of an indemnification clause in a contract, but I think you really don't want to be on the hook for a publisher's expenses for dealing with a book challenge.
Jeff, I have to ask you, doing the work that you do every day, day in and day out, how are you able to get out of bed in the morning facing this frickin' tsunami of pardon my French, bullshit constantly? What drives you? What motivates you? What makes you realize that you're fighting the good fight?
You know, I said this last night. I did a talk at the New York Public Library. Wonderful panel. We were talking about these issues. And I said, the thing to remember is the other side, the fight is so intense because the other side realizes they've already lost. They're fighting this battle because the way we communicate has changed. You know, in terms of graphic novels, they're just part of 21st century literacy now. The themes in terms of LGBTQ rights and being part of society, that's part of American civic life. That is not going to be walked back. That is not going to change. That's not going to change in any of our lifetimes. It's not going to change for another 100 years, if ever, in the United States. That is part of American civic life. That is the new civics. And yeah, I think there may be some issues, some boundaries to work out in terms of education, but I think we're not in terms of what sort of images you might see at a book for kindergartners versus a book for high schoolers. But you know, one thing I don't think you're going to be able to do constitutionally or even morally is have those themes and those people excluded from works at any age range. It's like when I was growing up, I was born in the 60s. And so I saw some very interesting things in the late 60s and early 70s that just you don't see in America anymore. And you know, when I was growing up, it'd be things like, well, you know, the Supreme Court said interracial marriage is legal, but you know, you don't really want to have kids see that because it's not good for kids to be involved in these relationships, and so complex, and so we want to protect children. I even had a class when I was growing up. There were kids from the inner city who were relocated to a little group home, and they were even educated in a different track for us, in a way, in public school, where basically the now say, you know, people of color were located in one track. They were never mixed with my, you know, kids who weren't there. It was basically sort of a last vestige of segregation, sort of hiding things. You will never, I think, be able to hide LGBTQ people anymore. You will never be able to hide the history of discrimination anymore. And there are people who are fighting this. And so we may work out some details of what's in a book here or there, but you're never going to eliminate it. It's here to stay. Yeah. And so I guess I wake up and I go, you know, we've already won the battle. So let's just figure out how to make that a visible reality. You know, the other side has showed its cards. They know they're losing. They're desperate. You don't try to get a law passed to put people in jail unless you know you've lost the culture. When you're trying to use force in that way.
Right.
So it's like one of the arguments I found really effective, we deployed across the country, is people come to us and they say, "Oh my word, they're going to school and they're saying you're corrupting children and you're setting such a bad example for children. And what about the future of the children and their mental health and their development?" I go, "Well, what about the children? What are we teaching them if you say that people who are protected by American civil rights law and the Constitution should be hidden, that you shouldn't be allowed to talk about it, that you should be thrown in jail if you try to talk about it? What's the example that you're setting for children when you say that somebody who holds to one particular vision of morality should have that morality enforced by the law against all the other people in society, many of whom don't share that same point of view?" Because that's the example you're setting for the children, that the people who shout loudest, demand things, who use the law to run up costs and drive libraries out of business, the brute force to enforce one's own point of view of morality. That's what you're telling. Mike makes right. Is that really what America's about? Is that really what we're about as a country? And it's not. It's absolutely not. So I guess I wake up in the morning just confident.
You're on the side of right.
Confident that we've already won.
Yeah.
I've learned. I said I was a religious historian, and I've studied these things for hundreds of years, and there's just a recurring cycle of there's some new media development or new sort of understanding of values, and there's a violent reaction to it, attempts to use a law to shut things down, and then eventually what is seen as dangerous is normal. It's like heavy metal in Dennis Kitchen's books or Robert Crumb. And this is the left and right thing fighting Robert Crumb. There are just certain things that are now seen as classics that were once seen as dangerous, and people are trying to see them as dangerous again. But it's just not going to win, or at least it's not going to win if we do the things that we have in our power to do to make sure that it doesn't win. There'll be some temporary lost battles here and there. That's inevitable. But the cultural shift has already happened, and it's just about making a reality. So that's really how I see it. And so I think it's important point of view for everybody, because I have talked to a lot of people across the country who, particularly when they're caught up in the midst of a legal thing and they're facing loss of their jobs, or their husband might get fired because they're associated with a person, or their wife might be fired, or their library may be defunded, or somebody might go to jail, and they're like crying and they don't know what to do. You go, well, okay, let's do what we can to get through this, but just, you're not alone. We've won these things before. It's going to work out okay. Just keep the faith, be strong, don't be afraid, and we'll get through this. That's incredibly important to me. It's incredibly important to be not to feel defeated, because we're not going to lose this. I'm absolutely convinced.
You've made me feel a little better. Jeff, I can't thank you enough for the time you've given us this evening. This has been fascinating and really, really important. And we very much appreciate the information and the insight that you shared with us this evening. Before we go to questions, people might have some more questions for you. I would encourage everybody to go online and Google the history of the book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. That is a real interesting story of censorship and reading rights, and it's a wild tale. Does anyone have any questions for Jeff specific to what we've talked about, or any issues of book banning, censorship, anything like that?
Well, yeah.
Joel?
I just wanted to mention, I write a history blog, and I've converted it into a manuscript called Another Girl in Pants.
Another what?
Another Girl in Pants.
Oh, right.
And because the first drag laws in this country were enacted against women, not men.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Women dressing up. And in fact, we wouldn't even recognize these as pants nowadays, particularly since they're worn under a skirt. But it was just considered, civilization was going to collapse. And the other thing to keep in mind is what the politically correct phrase is changes, because I worked primarily 1848 to 1868. reading
Mhm.
news media. And words like amalgamationist were
Mhm.
very loaded words back then.
Mhm.
A guy serving in one of the quote colored regiments would have knocked your block off if you called him African American.
Mhm.
Whole point was he was serving to prove he was American.
Mhm.
So there's this thing of it's not just comic books. There's a constant press generally to hold back. You know, the conservative says, let's hold back the tide of change.
Mhm. You know, can I
So
don't mean to jump in. Sorry about that.
but you know, I just think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just the books.
Mhm.
You know, it's all kinds of things like that.
I would love to, you said, if you could put a link to your blog in the chat, and also I'd love to, if you said you're writing a book,
Yeah.
I would love to see it, because before I did this gig, I was associate director of the Fashion Law Institute, the world's first academic center dedicated to the law, culture, business of fashion. And we've actually been doing stuff with, and I've been also an ethical advisor to major corporations, including Gucci and other stuff. So, and we've talked about these issues for years. You know, we actually got dozens of companies to change their dress code laws, or dress codes, worldwide. It's been an issue of us. We recently just did 3 panels at the Fashion Law Institute, New York Comic Con, and San Diego Comic Con on anti-drag laws and their implications for cosplay and the drag community. So that the anti-drag is something that is a real interest to us, and the
Well, if I get your
and the
email, I'll
CBLDF has
send you
been,
the info.
it's in the chat. My email's in the
Okay.
chat.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll see it.
And we've actually, CBLDF has been partnering with the Fashion Law Institute in fighting anti-drag laws. We've actually testified against anti-drag laws that were under consideration. So that's a very important topic.
Does anyone else have any questions? I don't have.
Oh, I see a hand from Megan.
Yeah, I have one question. So you and the Legal Defense Fund work more of a reactionary capacity. Something's already happened, already been challenged, or advisory. Do you work with any like activist groups that can help with political legislation and proactive work like that?
Excellent question, which I can answer in 2 ways. One, we have, now that we've been immersed in the next gen, you know, the current wave, which every, you know, history, there's repeated history, but there also, the other side keeps advancing and changing and adapting and coming up with new arguments. And I want to be able to assess where the other side was now and where it was going. Getting ahead of the arguments that are going to come is something I've been talking about with people behind the scenes in the free speech movement. You know, the argument that the civil rights laws are at the core of civil rights issues, at the core of this, and that the book bans can be discriminatory, actually grew out of some meetings that I had with some people that I put together with lawyers from, you know, different groups about how to handle these issues.
Jeff,
You know,
excuse me, I need to step away for just 1 second. Please continue. I'll be right back. I need to take care of something.
You know, so we're constantly trying to strategize about what's next. And that's incredibly important to me. And so that's actually going to be theme of it's been a theme of my speaking, and it's going to be a theme of my writing, so that everybody can see where our thoughts are on that. But beyond that, you know, in terms of working with activist groups, that's actually something that we do. We do work on legislation. You know, again, we're a charity, but there are ways for charities to get involved in these issues legally, perfectly legally. And at San Diego Comic-Con, I was honored to be part of the launch of the Popular Arts Caucus in Congress with Representative Robert Garcia and the Library of Congress, which is a new coalition, a bipartisan coalition in the House of Representatives to promote legal reform that, well, it was primarily driven by comics. Representative Garcia is a huge comics fan. And so it's about coming up with a policy agenda that will actually help advance legislation at the federal level that will help protect comics in a number of different ways. So we're active in state legislatures, providing testimony, talking to people, active federally. And also, I think the next phase is going to be some things you're going to see in written form. So I hope that answers your question. but yeah, we do work with activists. We like activists. Activists are cool.
Yeah, that was sort of my question. I'm an accountant, but we're working with a client that is a nonprofit that also has a 501c4 political. And so there's frequently some crossover there, as long as you can keep your finances separate.
Yeah, and here's the and I'm glad you mentioned 501c4, because one of the things that is political organizations are getting in the mix, and 501c4, you know, it's a different tax category. And one of the things that 501c4s can do that 501c3s can't is intervene for or against a candidate in a political campaign. And so that's where we have to draw the line, because we have been asked to, in fact, very recently, you know, we've been asked to very publicly oppose certain people running for office. And it's not that we don't necessarily oppose certain people running for office. It's just that as a charitable organization, if you say, don't vote for this person, you could lose your tax exemption. And so that's a line where we have to draw. Now, I'm a tax exempt organizations lawyer. That's how I got my start. I studied with the guy who created it as a legal field at Yale Law School. I'm pretty confident I know how to thread the needle on what's legit and what's not legit. So I'm always open to conversations with anybody who's interested in working together, collaborating on those issues, including 501c4s. So just so you know. But I will just also be able to identify what the landmines are and say, this is absolutely, you know, I know you want us to be part of a campaign to take down Trump, but you know, you got to understand.
Right. Have you ever thought about creating a sort of partnership 501c4?
Yeah, I have. And like I said, it's what I do sort of as a profession, you know, in terms of as a tax exempt organizations lawyer. So yes, I have thought about 501c4. I've thought about some other legal structures that we could use. I just started with a fund in 2020. And so a lot of what we were doing was adapting to the new situation and rebooting the fund for a new generation. And in my vision, that could be part of it.
Thank you, Megan.
It's a great question, by the way. I wonder, anytime you get in sections of the tax code, I'm going to be really happy about the question.
It's new information to me, so I'm like very excited about it because I'm coming at it as an accountant. So I'm like,
yes,
okay, but this can't be charged to the company credit card for that.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Does anyone else have questions for Jeff? Okay, Jeff, I thank you so much, man. This was just amazing. And again, our sincere thanks for the time you've given us, the information and the insight that you've shared with us. It's really important. We got a lot out of this, and thank you. Just thank you so much for everything.
Look, thanks for great questions, and just thanks for doing what you do. You know, one of the things that I loved about living in the area was how creative it was. I've known so many people from that area. I still do, and I am so glad to know that you exist. I'm glad that you're helping each other. I'm glad you're having sessions like this. So kudos to you. It was a real, I really enjoyed being here. This was fantastic. So thank you so much.
This is actually, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary as a writing organization this year.
Wonderful.
So,
wonderful.
Yeah. And next year we'll be putting on our 15th spring conference. We hold a writing conference every year. We took a break this year because we had other things that we wanted to do in celebration of our anniversary. We're picking the conference up again next year. But yeah, we try to bring in people who have important things to say to writers. Other writers, fiction and nonfiction. A couple weeks ago, we hosted a TAF talk with Nathaniel Philbrick, who wrote In the Heart of the Sea, among many other. He's a historian and just a magnificent writer. And I highly recommend him if you've never read him. He's just terrific. And so that's what we do. We try to bring in people with unique voices, see what they have to say, see what we can learn from them. This was a perfect opportunity.
Excellent. Really well, thank you so much. It was great to be a part of it. You know, I know it was on Zoom, which meant I couldn't have any barbecue with you all, but I do miss that tremendously.
Well, if you come to make your way to the Triangle, let us know, and we will take you out for barbecue.
That sounds like a plan.
Absolutely.
All right.
Certainly will.
Thank
So,
you so
Jeff,
much.
we have just a couple other things. If you want to hang with us, you're more than welcome to do that. This is the part of our monthly meeting where we kind of share our good news and people talk about their latest sales or any other good news that they have going on. And let me open that up. Does anyone have anything to share?
Yeah.
Joel?
My article on the state fair came out in this month's Walter magazine,
Awesome.
and the check didn't bounce either. That's always it was quick and it didn't bounce. I have my priorities, and
That's awesome.
so, but the thing is, it's like, when you write one article, see what else you can find for something else, because in doing the research, of course, I came across the information on the segregated state fairs and county fairs. And that's the sort of thing a national magazine would be interested in.
For sure. How many have you done for Walter now, Joel?
I think 9. I think 9. They don't pay huge amounts, but they do pay.
Yeah, it's a nice magazine though. It's a prestigious magazine.
Well, we had Anne Monique, a couple of months ago talking, and she's an excellent editor.
That's good to know. Before we move on, Michaela Lawler is with us. Michaela, just want to extend a TAF congratulations. Michaela got married over the weekend.
Thank you, Don.
And I don't know if you saw it, but a couple weeks ago, maybe, a lot of TAF members were sharing their insights on the keys to a successful marriage. I hope you got to see that thread.
I'll take a look at it. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to extend a quick thank you to Jeff for this meeting tonight. I found it particularly interesting because I'm hoping to go to law school myself.
Oh, wow. Cool.
I work as a court reporting monitor at the Danbury, Connecticut Superior Court.
Oh,
so
wow.
We see a lot of really interesting cases and trials. So, and then I have a master's of fine art in creative and professional writing. So I would be interested in maybe doing something in the IP field or maybe even in criminal law. So
Excellent.
Thank you for tonight. This was great.
That's fantastic. Excellent.
That's awesome, Michaela.
Yeah.
On the good news front, I'd want to note that today Encyclopedia Britannica posted my article on the Flintstones. So if you want to know everything about the Flintstones, go to Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yabba dabba doo.
That's awesome.
Sarah?
I'm going to have to read this, as you know, professionally.
Yeah. It's been an interesting gig, Jeff. It really has. I've written on everything from mass murder to the television show Taxi and literally everything in between. It's been awesome. Sarah, did you have a question or a comment?
A good thing come up. So my book proposal got accepted by Lisa Hagen. She's representing it, and the proposal's been requested by 5 editors, and we're waiting to hear back.
That's wonderful. 5 editors. That's fantastic.
Yeah, very excited and just waiting in anticipation,
Yeah, hopefully there'll be a bidding war.
Ooh,
yeah, that'd be great.
Nice.
That's awesome. Please keep us posted.
Definitely.
Drew?
Yeah, Don, I just wanted to thank you for participating in the 7th annual Carolina Book and Writers Conference. We had a really successful one. There were some very interesting speakers about AI in the session that I think attracted a lot of people. So we found it to be our best yet. And thank you for your contribution to it. And
I had a blast, Drew. I had so much fun. And there was a lot of wonderful questions in my session. I really, really enjoyed it. How many attendees did you have over the weekend?
We had probably 100, 150, somewhere around there, in and out.
Yeah.
Because it was a 3-day conference. So most people don't. We had a couple people somebody from the West Coast that got up at 5:30 every morning and sat through all of them for 3 days in a row. So
that's dedication. Well, I hope you do it again next year.
We're planning on it.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Great.
Hannah?
I presented for the Fine Lines anthology for their last writing conference. And the feedback that David Martin, who's in charge of all that, was so positive, they've asked me to come again for the January one. So, and that topic will be It Matters.
What did you talk about this time?
Last one was hope.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great.
So that felt really good. I had a really good time doing it with writing prompts and things. And
Wonderful.
yeah. So I'm
Well,
looking forward to that.
we're finally finalizing everything for the 2024 conference, and I'll be making a big announcement about that in the next couple of weeks, just crossing some T's and dotting some I's, but we're very, very excited about this. I think it's going to be a great, great event. So I hope everyone will come. Anyone else have any good news to share? Megan?
I have a good news that's also going to be a question I'll put in the TAF chat, but I just got back from an 11-day trip all around Ireland. Wow. And went to Italy last year. And I've been really fortunate that my parents traveled with me a lot growing up. And I couldn't sleep the first night in Ireland for all of the ideas I had about writing, about travel, how-tos, making it more accessible for people. Because my partner turned to me and he's like, how did you plan this? Like, I wouldn't have known where to start. And so I was like, oh, I didn't think about this being a skill I had accidentally cultivated. So I'm going to reach out to the group soon for some guidance on that and how to.
I love that idea. Yeah, I can see a lot you can do with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, do share that with us. And tell your dad we said hi.
I will.
Thank
Thank
you. Aware
you.
specifically of tonight's event because Megan's dad is a comic book fan and has also written a lot of articles and a lot of comic book profile and biographies. And he's just into this big. So yeah.
I did text him when it was starting. I was like, you joining? Come on.
He told me he was going to be
go see my
visiting your
granddad.
grandfather though. So
Yeah.
I understand, but hopefully you'll watch it from the link. But yeah, Megan's dad is a terrific writer and a very knowledgeable about the history of comic books and its creators. So his books are terrific.
So Dewey
Dewey Kessel, yeah. He wrote the
wow,
Art of
so
Bernie
cool.
Severin.
You know him?
Yeah, I subscribe to Back Issue and
Yeah.
Isn't that a
Alter
great
Ego.
magazine?
It's amazing, absolutely amazing.
Do you also
So, yeah.
read Alter Ego?
Yeah. For years and years and years.
You're now my best friend. I've been honored and lucky to place a couple of articles in Back Issue and the sister publication Retro Fan, which is more about pop culture kind of stuff. But yeah, that's Tomorrow's Press. Tomorrow's Publishing is based here in Raleigh, and we've actually had the publisher John Morrow as one of our.
Oh yeah, such vital work. I mean, the historical articles are amazing. The interviews are such a resource. Absolutely love this. Just absolutely.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. I saw another hand up. Hannah, was that you?
That was I was just reminded that how often I got written up when I was teaching because I would use comics in my classrooms for silent reading because everyone in my family is dyslexic. And that's the only way my brother could learn how to read was by reading comic books. So I used that in my classes for kids who struggled with reading because I wanted to foster a love of reading. And then I wanted to find out if that was easier for them to read.
Yeah.
So because we read every day. And those reading assignments were always for pleasure.
What I tell people in education, particularly if they're opposed to it, is comics are 21st century literacy. You want to understand how to do a PowerPoint, understand how a comic works. You want to understand how to do something for TikTok or do your own movie or YouTube or whatever, a game, understand how comics work. They really are the center of everything now. So I think any school that doesn't include, I think comics should be part of standardized tests. It's just, you got to understand how it works. And anybody who does has an advantage over somebody who doesn't in terms of your kid today. If you're just starting out, you want to build a career, you understand the fusion of image and text, you just have an edge. And so, but our educational system for many districts, particularly ones I see that say that want to get rid of comics altogether because they think they're educationally inappropriate and whatever. I'm like, wow, why did you just set all your kids back, 20 years?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. You can't deny their power and their reach.
Yeah.
Really can't. And to me, a lot of the comic books is literature.
Yeah.
It really is. And I actually had an article in Writer's Digest on that, comic books as literature. And I interviewed Ed Brubaker and Garth Ennis for that article.
Oh, I was talking to this. I'm gonna tell something that's a joke here. I think it was Michaela, because I really do encourage people to become lawyers if they want to. But I was talking to a parent whose kid was getting some pressure because he loved comic books in the school and think it was a great idea. And I said, well, look at. I grew up, and the first word I remember reading was Batman from the Batman TV show, and I've been obsessed with comics. I've read thousands and thousands of comics since my earliest days on this earth. And did it keep me from doing things? I mean, I got this PhD, I got this Yale law degree, I did all this stuff, I've been doing all these things, and I've been a professor for 25 years. I said the worst thing that happened to me from reading comics all my life is I became a lawyer. So, I just, that's the only negative influence I can see on that. So, tell that to your teacher. I mean, and I can tell people, I know people who teach in seminaries. I know people, who are really amazing in terms of, plumbing and electricians and writers and, all parts of society in schools and everywhere who love comics. There isn't any part of our country where you can't find people who secretly or publicly love comics. So, yeah, the notion that they keep people back is just, that makes me mad.
No, that's not right.
Yep.
So before we go, anyone else, any comments, any questions, anything to talk about?
I'll just add something really quick, writing related this time. In September, I went up to Enfield, New Hampshire to do some book research for this historical fiction novel that I'm going to be working on during NaNoWriMo. So that was a really cool and cathartic experience. So just thought I'd throw that out there.
Got to do the research.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Jeff, where are you based?
I live in New York now.
Okay.
Yep. Although my work takes me around the country, but I really do live in New York.
Well, again, we thank you for the time you've given us tonight. This was wonderful. It really was. I can't thank you enough. I love everything. So this was a great meeting.
I'm so glad you reached out. I'm glad to talk to you again. I think you all are amazing. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.